Understanding China has become more difficult than ever, yet also more important than ever. Hardening geopolitics has made travel to China more difficult, but not impossible. Join me, Scott Kennedy, for an on-the-ground look at China, for conversations with people shaping China and scholars exploring the country firsthand. What makes China tick? Where is the country going? How should the U.S. respond to the China challenge? We'll dive into all this and much more on this podcast. Welcome to China Field Notes. Hi, everybody. This is Scott Kennedy. Welcome to another edition of China Field Notes. I am absolutely delighted to have with us today Yao Yang, who is one of China's best economists, a longtime friend of mine, and someone I have been deeply, deeply hoping we could get on China Field Notes to help us understand the direction of China's economy. Let me give you a brief introduction to Yao Yang, and then we will get started. He is professor and dean of the Dishuihu Advanced Finance Institute, which is part of Shanghai University of Finance and Economics. Most of you probably know that he spent the majority of his career at Peking University. He was originally a student there where he did his undergraduate and master's studies, but he eventually returned to be professor and dean of the National School of Development, which he did for almost 12 years, and really raised the profile of Peking University's global span by its research and the development of the school. He's recently just moved down to Shanghai, where he is joining us today. Yao Yang did his PhD work at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I say that with pride as another person who spent a long time in the Big Ten, although a little south of Wisconsin in Indiana. His research includes the new political economy, economic transitions and development in China, and political philosophy. If I read all of the articles and books that Yao Yang has written, we'd be here until next week before we even started the conversation, because he has published hundreds of papers in leading journals, not just in China, but in Western top-tier journals from the American Economic Review, American Political Science Review, and Management Science, and others. He's also written or edited a dozen books on all sorts of important topics about economics and philosophy. And even more important than that, he's a fantastic teacher. And in 2006, he was named the best teacher at Beida by the Student Union. And so that's saying a lot. Someone who is a fantastic researcher, a great teacher, a great leader and administrator, in addition to everything else that he does. Yao Yang, welcome to China Field Notes.
Thank you, Scott, for having me here. Long-term friend. I love to talk with you.
Well, we are really delighted and grateful for you spending a little bit of time with us today. So I want to talk a little bit about your background and then a lot about the Chinese economy, and then also about U.S. China relations. And so, but let's just start just with a more basic question, because you're a scholar and you work on economics, and that isn't everybody's cup of tea. So how did you originally become interested in economics and then decide to go to the University of Wisconsin?
Well, it was actually an accident. My undergraduate major was geography. Upon graduation, I was thinking whether I should go to the graduate school. Now, a friend of mine came to me and said, "Hey, look, there's a new graduate institute called the Center for Management Science. We should go there." So then we took the exam and we got in. But eventually, there was no teacher, a professor who understood what the management science really meant, right? So eventually, we learned a lot of math and also economics. Okay, so that's how I got on economics. Then by the time of my graduation from the graduate school, that's the end of the 1980s. Almost everyone in Beida want to go to United States, right? So, but the only university that gave me a full scholarship, that was University of Wisconsin Madison, right? And they were so nice to wait me for 2 years until I got, all the approval and also the visa, right? So for that, I feel really grateful for University of Wisconsin and also the state of Wisconsin.
To the world's benefit, you are an economist. But I'm just curious because, Beijing can get cold, but it's not Madison cold. So what was it like going to Madison, Wisconsin and enjoying their winters?
Well, the winter in Wisconsin is really long, right? Almost just 6 months. I always remember, by the time I was Thanksgiving, we roast the turkey. Then there must be a huge snow, the first big snow in Wisconsin, right? And starting from that day, we had to endure a long winter. Yeah, it was cold, but it was fun. Right? It was really fun, right? You walk on the snow, you walk on the ice. It's quite an experience. At least my son loved it.
Yes. So I've been there for visits in March, and the lake that's next to the campus was still frozen. Yeah, people ice
Mondolan
fishing.
Lake, Lake
Yes,
Mondolan.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. So I suppose studying in a place like that helps you concentrate. If you went to the University of California, San Diego, or Stanford, you'd never be able to focus because it'd be too nice outside. Maybe. I
That's right.
suppose there's an economics research question there about the climate and one's proficiency as an economist, research paper that could be done. But let's switch topics. Um, so, you and I both been watching China and its economy for a long time. And a lot of people who observe China notice that in a variety of different ways, it's not followed the standard rules of promoting economic growth. There's been a lot of government intervention in the economy. There's not sufficient protection of property rights, both physical property and intellectual property. Lots of firms in China over the last few decades have had soft budget constraints. There is significant protection from international competition, and that's a polite phrase I'm using there. There's also been corruption in China over time that's waxed and waned. What do observers miss or get wrong with the picture of China's economic trajectory and whether or not it's followed the standard model for how an economy develops?
Well, that's a very interesting question. When I heard this question or read your question, I was thinking, over the last decade, the views on China's growth model have changed quite a lot. I mean, back to 10 years ago, no one asked this kind of question. I mean, in the field of economics and also China study, I think most people agreed that China could succeed economically, mostly because China has adopted market reform and adopt the protection of property and adopt the rule of law. Just to name it, all the good things that we should have for a good economy. I don't know why, over the last decade, the people's perception has been changed. To me, there's no secret to China's economic performance. That is to adopt almost the standard teachings of neoclassical economics. If China has some unique features, I would say that should be in the area of political economy. That is why the Chinese government has been able to adopt those pro-growth policy or the good recommendations put forward by standard economists, right? I think that's a more fascinating question. That's why, over the last several decades, I've been devoted to the study of the political economy in China. Right? To cut short, I think the key to China's success lays in three factors. Right? First, decentralization. So China is a huge country. Decentralization allows local government officials to have their own field, own domains of decision making. But decentralization is not enough. In many countries, decentralization leads to corruption. So China's second factor, success factor, is this promotion system, right? So if you grow your local economy, your chances to get promoted are going to be larger, right? So government officials are corrupt, like in other countries, but because there's a positive incentive, government officials work hard to promote local growth, to promote local people's welfare, so they can get promoted, right? And then the last factor is what I call a disinterested government in the center, right? So disinterested government means a government that's not uh, captured by special interest, that doesn't work for just a portion of the population. So what I want to say is that the Communist Party has played quite a significant role and a decisive role to get reforms done and to put forward pro-growth policy, right? So the Communist Party, in a sense, fits into Nancy Olson's notion of an encompassing organization. That is, its interest and mostly overlaps with the interests of the whole country. So I think that's kind of a short explanation for China's success from the political economy perspective.
So decentralization, promotion system for local officials that promotes growth, and then a disinterested government that isn't captured, that works for the overall interests of the country. That doesn't sound very different from the developmental idea of a developmental state that we've seen in Japan and other countries in East Asia. Do you think China intentionally saw those other countries as a model to follow? Or do you think that this is just an accident that it ended up this way?
Oh, definitely China has been learning from its neighbors, right? Particularly Japan and also those four tigers, right? But this probably goes deeper into Chinese culture, Chinese history, and also the so-called 100 years of humiliation that the Communist Party has inherited. In Chinese history, meritocracy was emphasized, right? So we had what we call the civic examination system to select capable and virtuous government officials, right? So the Communist Party has inherited this tradition. And also, I think the so-called 100-year communication also played a huge role over there. China is a country with a long, long history, unbroken record for almost 2,000 years, longest in the whole world. Right? So several generations of Chinese leaders, starting from Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, then Mao Zedong, they all had the same conviction. That is, in their lifetime, they had to build a strong China, right? So by the time when the Communist Party took power, the party got the chance to implement this conviction.
Let's take the lens that we're looking at China's economy and flip it around from the macro description you just gave to the micro and Chinese companies because it's companies that do the production, they come up with the ideas of what to make, etc. And I was just curious from your perspective, could you talk about maybe what's your favorite Chinese company or Chinese industry, and how does that fit into your picture of China's overall economic success?
I would say Xiaomi is currently my favorite company. I mean, there are many successful Chinese companies, right? Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent. But currently, to me, the most dynamic company is Xiaomi, right? Lei Jun is really a great entrepreneur. I mean, he understands the market. He understands the logic of entrepreneurship, right? So he started the Xiaomi as a almost a fashion company, right? So Xiaomi, the phone was cheap, but really fashionable, and it was loved by young people. Then over the time, Leijun accumulated capital, accumulated reputation. Then he began to move up the value ladder. And now Xiaomi's smartphones are number three in the world in terms of sales value, but its quality has also been improved quite a lot. Xiaomi now designs its own chips, and it's not on an entity list, so it can produce the top quality chips, right? So now Xiaomi smartphones, at least a part of its smartphones have become high-end smartphones. Okay, but you also know that Xiaomi has begun to produce electric vehicles, all right? In a very short period of time, its sales has skyrocketed, right? I have no doubt that Xiaomi cars going to be occupy a very significant share of the Chinese market and possibly the world market.
So I was just curious about Xiaomi, which originally was an IT device company that's now making cars. And I actually last year got a chance to go out to their factory and test drive the
Mm.
SU7 and have seen the Ultra as well. And what's an interesting contrast is that another company that's in the same space as Xiaomi, Apple, was also considering a car, and they did not go through with that project. And I think the reason Apple may not have gone forward is that the cost was high and they were worried about the market and demand. And China has 100 plus EV makers. Even though there's a lot of demand in China, that's still a lot of companies to compete against. So that kind of risk taking, is that a sign of China's more maturing market, or is it a sign of too much political incentives to invest in a priority industry that then perhaps might create problems down the road with, companies competing too much, and then a company like Xiaomi or others which are very good might actually end up in a problem of being in an industry where there is so much competition it might actually affect their overall bottom line.
Well, I have to say, in the case of Apple, Apple stopped its car plant probably mostly because Apple is making huge amount of money out of smartphones. There's no need, right, for Apple to produce EVs. Right? But in the case of Xiaomi, Xiaomi's smartphones at the time when Leijin decided to produce cars were not that kind of profitable. It was making money, huge money, but the profit rate just could not match the profit rate of Apple's, right? And also, the Chinese economy is still young compared with the American economy, and the Chinese entrepreneurs are still it's kind of a comparable with those entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, right? Young, energetic. In particular, Leijun I wouldn't say he's a young guy, but relatively speaking, he's still young, right? He's still energetic, full of dreams. That's probably the reason. But you're right. There probably are too many EV producers in China. To the very beginning, there were more than 140 EV makers in China. But now, if you count all the major EV makers, there are only about 40, right? I think over the next several years, we're going to see the number to come down again, right? There are people who are worried about the Xiaomi because, it's too quick, and who knows whether the EV cars can stand the test of the rough drive of the customers, right?
Yes.
But EVs are much simpler than a petrol-driven cars, right? So it has been simplified in order of 10 or even 100, right? So in that case, the old ideas about the safety, powertrain, all sorts of things no longer apply to EVs, right? And because of the participation of those electronic devices, so it's much easier for the engineers to monitor the driving of the car, right? And also the driver to monitor the cars. The only probably danger is that Xiaomi EV cars are just too fast. Probably Xiaomi should control the speed. Yeah.
Exactly, yes. When I test drove, we got up to a speed that would have broken a lot of laws in China and the
Right.
United States.
Right.
So,
That's
you
right.
know, I consider this what I call the warring states period of the Chinese EV industry, the 战国时期, where you have
That's
you
right.
have a lot of companies competing, which brings us to another topic, that is quite widely discussed in China this year, involution, 内卷 seems to be a huge topic. I even saw you on a TV program this summer when I was in China. And for those out there who may not be familiar with this idea of involution and what's going on in the Chinese economy, could you explain what involution is and why it seems to be a problem this year in China and whether it's going to be resolved? And perhaps you already gave a hint of that with regard to the reduction in numbers of EV companies, but maybe for other industries.
Evolution was first used by historian. He described those small farmers in northern China. Right? It was a word contrary to the word evolution, right? So evolution means you improve yourself. Involution means you exploit your own self. Okay, you like those small farmers. The time they didn't have any outside options, so they had to work harder and harder until they exhausted themselves. So they were exploiting themselves. So in today's context, it means you compete fiercely, but you don't increase your gain. Okay, or you don't increase the total pie in the industry. Like in the case of EV, right? We have so many EV companies that they compete by cutting prices in order to get larger market shares. But if your market share is larger, then others' market shares become smaller. Right? So this is a zero-sum game over there. And you look at the profits in the whole industry, it's just a small portion of the Teslas or Toyotas, right? So it's not sustainable. So consumers benefit from this kind of competition, but for the whole industry, it's really detrimental. Okay, but as you said, this is a worrying period for the EV industry. Probably after I don't know how many years, the number of EV companies is cut to say 20 or even 10, then those companies are going to make money. But why, in particular, in China, companies are engaged in this kind of production or price competition, not profit competition? I think there are several reasons. First of all, China saves too much, right? So we save 45% of our GDP. So about each year, we save about 9 to 10 trillion US dollars. And then we need to find places to invest those savings, right? So that's why whenever there is opportunity to make some money, then people begin to invest into that opportunity. So that's number one. Number two is that many companies want to become the biggest guy in the market, right? They have this dream to become bigger and bigger. So to do that, they cut their prices and to get a larger market share. Okay. And third factor is local governments. Right? Local governments allow to set up new companies. Why? Because new companies contribute to local GDP and also contribute to local taxes. China's largest tax is value-added tax, right? So value-added tax is different from corporate income tax. Corporate income tax is only levied when you make money, right? But VAT is levied as soon as you sell out your products. It really doesn't matter whether you make a profit out of your sales. Okay. So that's why we see so many unprofitable EV companies and other companies in other sectors are still surviving. And because the local governments want them to survive, so local governments can get the taxes out of those companies. Okay. And the last factor is about the financial sector. I mean, before 2018, China had a major financial reform. That reform unleashed the so-called shadow banking sector. So finance became so vibrant a sector. But of course, that created a lot of problems, right? So the government began this deleveraging campaign in 2017, 2018. That was necessary, but that also had some side effects. One of the side effects is that China's VC and PE sector has declined quite substantially, particularly private VC and PE companies, right? So at the highest point, the amount, the amount of money controlled by Chinese VC companies was almost 90% of the size of the VC sector in the US. And in 2017, the number of unicorns in China was higher than the number in the US. And now guess what? China's VC sector currently is now about 50% of US level. And the number of unicorns in China is only about 60% of the American number. Right? So when, the EV sector has a very good property that it burns money, right? Because you spend money on those startups. Right? You don't produce a new production capacity, but instead you produce new products, right? So you don't concentrate on this kind of vertical innovation, but you concentrate on this horizontal innovation. You produce more and more products, so you don't have to compete on just one single product. Okay, so that's my explanation.
So I'm wondering, because at the beginning we were talking about the sources of China's economic success, and you talked about the political economy of that. And then we've also talked about the problems of involution. Um, to get the success based on the political economy model of China, do you also have to accept the problems that come with involution? Are those two sides of the same coin to get the success of that political economy? You also that involution is just a cost of this approach, or can China fix the involution problem and still have the positive sources of growth that you mentioned?
Well, definitely, evolution is related to China's growth model. In particular, the third factor, local governments are playing a huge role in this process, right? Why local governments spend so much effort on growth? It's because of promotion, right? Our promotion system is based on government officials' performance. I mean, there have been a lot of talks and efforts to correct this. That is, don't base promotion purely on economic performance. But that's really hard, right? Because economic performance is so significant. Even today, it's a significant factor. Okay. And to economists, that's very easy to understand. When you have, there's a theorem called the multitasking theorem. So when an agent faces multitask tasks, okay, the agent is going to put more effort into the task that's either to measure and to observe. And what's that for government, local government officials? That's economic growth. Okay. So I don't think we can easily get away from the system, right? I mean, we are getting into a kind of a fundamental problem in the Chinese system. That is the relationship between the center and the local as being a problem in the last 2,000 years since Qin Shi Huang united China and established this bureaucratic monarch system. Okay. So I think that China has to find a balance in the process. I don't think that we can find a static model to solve this whole problem.
Well, I know that there was a time when there was a discussion about whether or not to eliminate growth targets. And that ended up actually making local officials confused because when you have no clear target, then they don't know what to do. And so they decided to come back. And so people, well, okay, but they're still tinkering. Just recently, China issued a proposal for the next 5-year plan, the 15th 5-year plan. Do you think that the proposal that was recently issued, we'll still have to see the details next spring, addresses the kind of problems that you just described?
Not totally. Domestic demand is mentioned by the guidelines. Right? And now we only have a guidelines, all right, for the next 5-year plan. And also a unified national market is emphasized. But if you look at in details, you're going to find the top two tasks. Number one, to put more efforts into the real economy and also the new productive forces, and also to build a strong and a resilient domestic value chain, right? And then number two, to continue on innovation, particularly 0 to 1 innovation, and also to make sure that we control our own technology. There is a new term called 自立自强. That is, how to translate that?
Self-strengthening, I think I would call that,
Yes,
self-strengthening.
self-strengthening and self-reliance. Okay. Right.
Yes.
So this is a new proposal in that sense. To me, I think that the China-US competition is in the background. You know, U.S.-China competition will be defined by technological competition, and China cannot lose this competition because it's not just about so-called technological supremacy, but also related to other issues, particularly probably Taiwan issue, right? All related. So that's why in this 5-year plan, the top two tasks are both related to U.S. China competition.
Well, why don't we talk more about the US and China? And the last decade or so, our bilateral relationship's gotten a lot worse. We've seen tensions rise. The US in the first Trump administration increased tariffs 4 times on China. At the time, we thought it was a lot. Looking back, it was just a few percentage points, but it was still quite shocking for folks. US has imposed a whole variety of export controls and other restrictions. We've seen China respond with its own tariffs, export controls. This year, there's been a lot of tension around rare earths and the supply of them. The two sides recently met and, reached a tentative agreement on some of these issues. But why do you think US China relations have gotten so bad over the last decade? Is it something just inevitable because China's a rising economy, or is it about someone's personality or some other factor that has led the two countries at the official level to have such a strained relationship?
Well, actually, back in 2010, I actually sensed U.S. and China would have a showdown someday. At that time, U.S.-China relations were kind of good, right? So I talked with my American friends and also Chinese friends. They were shocked. Why do you say this? Basically, I made that assessment for two reasons. First, China will become stronger and stronger, right? And U.S. will become allergic, right? Because there is a danger that China will replace the United States, at least in South China Sea around China, right? This region, okay. And second, many Americans and also many Chinese at that time didn't understand that China would never change its political system. Okay. So for the two big countries with two different political systems, okay, and in particular, communism was named only the enemy in the United States for a period of time, right? So many Americans still have that memory. So for those kind of two countries meeting each other, we both with a lot of energy and high technologies, military powers, it's hard not for them to collide with each other, right? Sooner or later. So that's my explanation.
So this sounds a lot like economic physics, that basically two very large powers, competing interests, competing systems, just have a very difficult time coexisting. So that sounds like you're not blaming any particular leader. You're not blaming Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Xi Jinping. You're just saying these two large powers with very different systems inevitably clash. Do I
Mm.
got that right?
Yeah.
Then how do these two large countries that are competing at the top of the economic value chain have political systems that are quite different, different views about security in the region? How on earth are we going to get along? How are we going to coexist?
Yeah, that's a really good, great challenge for all two countries, right? The U.S. China competition is not like the U.S. Soviet Union competition. In the Cold War, United States and Soviet Union didn't have any connections, right? So the competition was geopolitical, military. But in the case of U.S. China competition, we have to coexist economically, right? And then on the other hand, we have to compete politically, geopolitically, and even militarily. And not hot war, but you know, basically competition on the technological front. Okay, so we need to find a new framework to guide this kind of competition. I don't know the solution, but We got to find a new framework.
So recently, the two sides reached a tentative agreement in South Korea to put some constraints on around export controls, reduce tariffs a little bit in some other areas. But in the US, there was big concern about China's expansion of its export control system regarding rare earths. But do you think that that actually is a reason to find some hope for stability, that now that China has leverage and uses that leverage to push back, that maybe one source of stability in the relationship is that both folks now have a loaded weapon, can threaten the other, and it forces the other side to act with more caution? Or are you worried about future escalation because both sides now have all of these weapons that they have available to use against the other?
I think you're totally right. Right. So when Trump decided to start the first round of trade war, China refrained not to use rare earths as a weapon. I still remember President Xi Jinping went to Jiangxi to the rare earths company, right? So I said, oh my God, China is going to use rare earths as a weapon. But eventually China didn't use it, right? China kind of waited, passing the first Trump administration, then the Biden administration. And then finally, the Chinese leadership said enough is enough. We are going to retaliate in kind, right? So, in the last several months, China began to really use rare earths as a weapon. Personally, I don't like this kind of factor, tit for tat export control because it's detrimental for both countries and also for other third parties. Okay. So it's just like now we are competing which country is going to endure the pain more or longer, right? I don't think that's a good solution. It's good to see that both sides have decided to stop the escalation. Today, the Chinese government announced taking, I think, 2 dozens of American companies out of the entity list, right? So that's a good move, right? United States probably is also going to do something to respond to China's gesture, right? So my guess is that after this more than 8 years of fighting, both countries have realized this kind of tit for tat retaliation is not good for either country. So we should it's kind of come down to become more rational. And I believe eventually the two countries will come sit at the table and then negotiate a framework to regulate the two countries' competition. I mean, look, even United States and the Soviet Union eventually reached some agreement to guide and regulate the military competition. Right? You remember before the Cuban Missile Crisis, the two countries almost at the verge of nuclear war. But after the crisis, both countries realized, no, 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 it's just so dangerous. We don't want to get into a nuclear war. So the two sides began long talks, and eventually they reached some agreements regarding missiles and also nuclear weapons. I think eventually China and the United States will reach that point to negotiate some rules.
Well, I hope you're right. I hope we don't need some kind of incident similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis to get us to that point, that we might do so beforehand. We also I think we're still in the process of building our tools that we could use against each other. So there's still this sort of economic security arms race that we're engaged in. And I'm not sure whether we'll be able to use sort of the arms control model of negotiation amongst two parties to manage the economic security tools and weapons that we have, in part because the use of those tools is somewhat decentralized. In the case of the U.S. Soviet Cold War, just a very small number of people centrally controlled managed nuclear weapons. And now we've got folks that are involved in cyber, many people in different parts of the supply chain, et cetera. So to get us over where we are now to a more stable place, I still think we've got a process, a bumpy road still is what I expect. But I want to end this on a more positive note. And because you're not just someone who is a public intellectual and talks about ongoing policy issues, you're also a scholar who has their own scholarly research projects. And I'm just curious, what can you tell us about one project that you're currently working on, what you're looking at and what problems you're trying to solve, the type of data you might be using, so that our listeners can be on the lookout for when this finally is published?
Oh, I have kind of a continuous project, the impacts of the leveraging of 2017, 2018. I think, you know, after 8 years, it's time for us to reevaluate the deleveraging campaign, right? Yeah, so I have already got a paper accepted by management science. In that paper, we look at how deleveraging of local governments sent a kind of a shockwave through the supply chain, right? So the negative impacts of the government deleveraging actually has been much larger now we have thought, right? So behind that, there is a kind of academic topic. Usually we think about government spending, government investment having a so-called crowding out effect for private investment, right? There are many papers on that. But in the case of China, because government investing into properties, investing into infrastructures, and that may increase the values of factories, private properties, and that may have a kind of a financial accelerator effect, right? So in that sense, government investment can have a crowding in effect. That's probably secondary, right? Compared with the crowding out effect. But if you have a sudden deleveraging, this crowding in effect will become kind of a reverse crowding effect, right? So private investment will come down together with the government investment. Okay, so I'm working with a postdoc of mine on the financial impacts of subways. Right? So we find a significant effect. So if there's a subway station built close to a company, then that company can borrow more because it's a factory, it's a land worth more. So they can have a larger collateral values to get more financial from banks. Right? And so that's kind of a research I'm working.
Terrific. Terrific. Well, we'll all be on the lookout for that. And when it does come out, we'll share that with everyone, along with the links to the podcast as well. Yaoyang, this has been a fantastic discussion. I wish we had more time to delve into all of the different issues related to China's economy and U.S. China relations, but we've learned a lot already, and I want to thank you for joining us on China Field Notes.
Thank you very much for having here. I hope we have time to meet either in China or in the US.
Me too. Thanks again. Thanks for listening to China Field Notes. Stay up to date with our latest releases by following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to great content. Until next time.